access. Oh gosh, come on. Admit. All right, hold on. I think I might have gotten it. Let's see. So far, I'm showing. Oh, wait. Hi, for those of you that are on, we are trying to get everybody in. So just give us just a couple minutes. Tyler.
So hi folks, thank you all for your patience while we were trying to set this up. I apologize again for the technical difficulties, but in lieu of time, we're just gonna get the party started, as I like to say. So this should be recording. Let me just make sure. Okay. There we go. Okay, so we're just going to get started. So hi, everyone. Thank you again for joining us. I'm Melissa O'Connor. I am one of the trauma therapists through the Family Services CBSS program, and usually give a whole spiel, but in lieu of time, I'm just going to move forward into our training for today. Okay, let's go to the next screen. And just to confirm, everyone can see the PowerPoint well?
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. So today we're doing a training on, living in isolation while during COVID and as it relates to victims of domestic violence or interpersonal violence. I'm going to use that term interchangeably throughout this training. So today we're going to just go over the basic dynamics of abuse and how it aids an abuser in gaining power and control over their victim. We're also going to be learning how to understand how COVID has been impacting victims of intimate partner violence and identify contributing factors that have caused victims to be at increased risk of violence during this pandemic. Also, if everyone can mute themselves besides me, that would be lovely. Thank you. Participants will also gain knowledge about the measures taken in the state of New York to better assist victims and learn about available resources for victims of intimate partner violence, one of them including Family Services. Okay, and also to be mindful, I always like to make people mindful while we're doing trainings as it relates to violence of any sort that, I don't pretend that like anyone in this training may or may not have experiences themselves or might be secondary victims or have other loved ones in their family who've experienced this. So just being mindful of your own self-care during this training. And also another housekeeping thing I wanted to address is that tomorrow is actually Thursday of Purple Thursday. So if you did not already know from all the things that are going on throughout the month of October, October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and tomorrow is Purple Thursday. So if you do have something that is purple, please do wear.
Maybe you can help me. I had a question about my.
Okay, again, if everyone could please mute themselves, just to be mindful. I do not have that ability to mute everyone, I don't believe. Let me just.
Oh my God.
I can hear, okay, there we go. I think everyone's muted now. Thank you again. Awesome. Okay. So yeah, if you have the opportunity to wear purple, that would be lovely. And then send it to marketing if you do take a picture with yourself wearing purple. Okay, so just diving into the first real side of the training. So what is intimate partner violence? And how does that relate to domestic violence and dating violence and teen dating violence and all of those other things that are under the umbrella of intimate partner violence? So intimate partner violence is an intentional pattern of abusive behaviors done to exert and maintain power and control over an intimate partner. If we're relating this to domestic violence, same terminology, except we also might just add in, you know, other family members or people that, as we defined, domestic violence partners, that could be people that you live with or have some type of intimate relation with, that may that be a family member or a close friend, things like that, depending on the laws and how that's being recognized. And when we're looking at intimate partner violence, we're looking at different types of abuse that they're using to gain power and control over their victim, because abuse is all about, again, gaining power and control over another. So they might use verbal, emotional, digital abuse, stalking, financial or resource abuse, sexual abuse, or physical abuse. And again, we have the power and control wheel, which is a great resource, especially if you're working with clients, or if you are, you know, someone who's in a situation, maybe just giving them information on what abuse looks like. Because I think for the general population, a lot of people think, oh, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, we're thinking automatically, oh, there must be physical violence in some sense, but that might not actually be the case as we go through this training. And just noting the different dynamics of violence, it's important to look at the cycle of abuse. So there's different portions in an abusive relationship. We're kind of going in different phases. These phases can easily be something that, you know, span over a longer period of time, which could be weeks, it could be months, it could be years, or it could be something that really happens rapidly, even in a period of a few hours or throughout a day. So the first phase in the cycle of abuse is the tension building. So this is when things are kind of feeling off. The abuser might be making passive comments to their victim. This is kind of where you hear the term walking on eggshells. So the victim is feeling like, okay, I have to anticipate what my abuser wants or needs so that I can try to meet their needs, so that this doesn't escalate into something else. So we're trying to appease our abuser, trying to make things perfect, when in actuality, you know, you could make the most beautiful dinner, if we're going to use a cliche, or make everything absolutely perfect, but it's not about making things perfect at all. It's really about the dynamics of the abuser versus what the victim is or isn't doing. Then this can transition into the incident. So this could look like an act of verbal, physical or sexual abuse, or something that is a form of abuse that is being used, so kind of like an escalation. So this could be, I don't know, there's an argument and then that turns into a slammed door or something being broken, or something else. So kind of like the escalation of an event. And then after that, there's the reconciliation phase of the cycle. So this could be where the abuser is doing those kind of like cliche, like apologies. This could be where they are giving, you know, flowers and gifts and all of these apologies and, you know, like, oh, I'm so sorry, you know, that I did that. I didn't mean to. My anger got the best of me, kind of things like that, but also inserting moments of doubt where the abuser will be like, well, if you just didn't do X, Y, and Z, then this wouldn't have happened, because you know how passionate I am about our love, or how, you know, whatever, you know, triggers me and that causes me to, you know, produce this violence. So it's like we're apologizing and doing all those things, or saying like, you know, I'm going to change, you know, this is never going to happen again. But we're also kind of putting in moments of those doubts of, you know, letting the victim know like, oh, this is kind of your fault that this happened. Or on the flip side, the reconciliation of it could also just be the abuser using gaslighting, where they're like, that never happened. Like it could be the next day, and they don't even acknowledge that this event took place, or making the client or the victim feel crazy, or things like that. And then it kind of goes into the calm, or more commonly known as the honeymoon phase of the relationship, where things are like calm, things, you know, seem to be going well. But then eventually, you know, this starts to lead up to the tension building, and picking up on, you know, the victim's flaws, or just, you know, the passive aggressive type of behaviors kind of start again. So being mindful of that. And again, this could span over, you know, weeks, months, years, or it could happen quickly over, you know, just a few hours. Always looks different. So just really diving into statistics when it relates to intimate partner violence. And throughout this training, we're going to look at things from the state of New York to the United States nationally to things globally, because again, we are in a global pandemic. And when it comes to domestic violence, even though we're in this pandemic as it relates to COVID-19, you know, domestic violence has been a hidden pandemic, a global hidden pandemic. So it's important to note all the different factors and how it's impacting everyone throughout the world. So in the United States, more than 10 million adults experience domestic violence annually. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 10 men experience some form of violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime. And then this can produce, you know, injuries, may that be physical injuries, psychological injuries, you know, getting symptoms of PTSD, or someone needing victim services. And also taking into consideration, you know, different gender identities, different sexualities, all of those kind of things. And it's also important to note too, when we're going through this, a lot of the statistics are based on cisgender, heterosexual norms, if we're looking at that in that case, but also taking point that 43.8% of lesbian women and 61.1% of bisexual women have experienced some form of violence by their intimate partner in their lifetime, as opposed to 35% of heterosexual women. So noting how if someone is a cisgendered female, I'm assuming that's where the statistic is coming from, versus a trans female, they have, if you are within the LGBTQ community, you are at an increased risk as opposed to someone who is a heterosexual woman. It's also important to note that when someone is a transgendered person, they are actually more at risk of experiencing intimate partner violence in public, so, and experiencing physical violence by their partner in public, which for me is alarming, because normally when we're talking about domestic violence, this is something where the abuser might be portraying themselves to the outside world as this like loving, charming, amazing person. And this is something that happens kind of behind closed doors. It's something that's like a little hushed, and it's just focused on the victim and trying to hide it from others. And that's a form of isolation, versus someone who is a transgendered person who's experiencing violence. You know, if this is being shown out on the street, you know, that for me, in terms of my knowledge around domestic violence, amplifies the risk of, you know, homicide, you know, and all those things, which is a risk factor for those within the trans community, have a higher risk of being murdered than someone who is cisgender. So just being mindful of that. Again, as it relates to gay men, 26% of gay men and 37.3% of bisexual men experience some form of violence, in comparison to 29% of heterosexual men in their lifetime. So, you know, in terms of statistics, it's, as it's pointing out, gay men are like a little less risk as opposed to heterosexual men. But if you're bisexual, just as if you're a bisexual woman, that is exemplifying the risk of violence. And as we're looking in New York State, from a study done in 2014, 32.3% of women in New York and 33.5% of men in New York experience intrapartner violence some point in their lifetime. So very similar statistics. Again, this doesn't, you know, go if it's like, okay, we're talking cisgender, transgender, sexuality, it doesn't break that down, which I think is important to note when we're looking at things. And then when we're comparing for law enforcement getting involved in domestic violence incidences in New York City in 2013, they received 284,660 calls versus throughout the entire state. And we're also being mindful of that because obviously New York City and the boroughs heavily populated in comparison to the rest of New York, which is a very large state. Throughout the rest of the state, it was 187,710 incidences in 2013, which was actually a decrease from 2012. But just looking at that number of basically being off by 100,000 in a very densely populated area versus the span of the whole state of New York, which, you know, is interesting. So globally, intimate partner violence during COVID. So this is kind of when the lockdown started to occur, is where most of these stats are coming from. So noting that when the initial outbreak of where in China, where the outbreak first initially occurred, during the month of February, domestic violence incidences tripled, or at least the reporting of domestic violence incidents tripled in comparison to the year prior. According to the United Nations Women, their statistics are showing that in France, there was an increase of 30% since the initiation of the lockdown for them in March. Argentina, they had an increase in 25% increase of domestic violence calls. Cyprus and Singapore, again, ranging from 30 to 33% in terms of increased calls to their helplines during their lockdown. Now, in terms of nationally from the United States, you know, different regions when their lockdown started to occur, such as Portland, Oregon, there was a 22% increase in arrests related to domestic violence in comparison to the weeks prior. In San Antonio, Texas, when after their lockdown down, they had an increase of 18% calls in March of 2020 in comparison to March 2019. And similarly for Jefferson County in Alabama, and then New York State as well. New York State, their calls were only 10%. So we're kind of seeing anywhere between 10 to 30% in terms of kind of what's being shown here. But in some nations, it actually had increased to over 300%, which we will see in a second. Yeah, so from the project, the Commonwealth Says No More project, which is a great organization, but they focus on violence against girls and women primarily. You know, feel free to look them up on Instagram to follow them. They have a lot of great stats and information that they share related to violence against women and girls. And they're showing that in terms of helpline calls, across the globe, they're seeing anywhere between 25 to 300% increase in calls during the pandemic. And also just to be mindful of how this hidden pandemic of domestic violence is impacting the world. Even before pre-COVID, there was globally $1.5 billion was being spent to aid those girls and women who are experiencing violence. So just, you know, in terms of monetary, that's obviously a lot of money that is going towards this cause because it's such a huge issue. And for the national hotline, you know, it was interesting for them because in the month of March, where a lot more countries and places, well, specifically for the United States, because this relates to the national hotline in America, they actually saw a decrease in calls of 6% in comparison to the year prior. And anyone who
Heather,
works with domestic
join the
violence,
meeting.
so anyone who works on a hotline, it is a rarity that you're going to actually have lulls in comparison to increases, and that kind of changes throughout the year. But just seeing a decrease in calls is very astonishing. But the reasoning for this could be that now that folks were isolated more in their homes, it's like, okay, how can I reach out to these resources I normally would use when my abuser is either in the same room as me or in the room next door? Though sometimes you may get calls, if you ever work on a hotline, you may get calls that the abuser is in the next room, even before COVID, which is risky. But it's less likely to occur when we're in close proximity, so not reaching out to those resources. But as things started to lift and shelter in place wasn't as stringent, in April, they noticed a 15% increase in comparison to the year prior. And roughly 10% of all their contacts were citing that COVID-19 was a condition of their experience. So this could be that COVID was influencing an increase in the abuse that they were experiencing in their home, or COVID was preventing them from getting resources such as shelters or other resources that they might meet in the community. And it's important to know too that even before COVID, that at least when folks were calling hotlines, the victim was citing at least two or more forms of abuse. And this was no change for those that are going through COVID, but more people were focusing that, like, okay, COVID is definitely impacting, what's going on in my relationship or with my abuser. Those are some more stats too, but we're gonna just be mindful of time. We may not get through everything today. Okay, so getting into factors specifically related to COVID that have impacted those affected by intimate partner violence. So first and foremost, social isolation is a huge component in here. So, we're moving away from people being able to, easily go to get resources. Maybe people aren't working, schools are closed down, and pretty much where we're going is we're going to be home. So isolation is a major factor. And in terms of during other pandemics or other stressful situations, that are impacting intimate partner violence during this time is stress, economic stress, disaster-related instability. I'm going to assume there are many folks on this training right now that this COVID has impacted, just a lot of things based on instability. Increased exposure to exploitive relationships. Again, close proximity around those people more, we're going to see, an increase in that. And also potential increase in negative coping mechanisms or maladaptive coping. So potential of excess alcohol consumption and reduced options for support. So these are all factors that can lead to an increase in risk. Now getting into more specifics. Now, even before COVID, isolation is a major tactic that abusers will use. And this is something where they're trying to separate their victim from loved ones, from support systems. They may be trying to humiliate or intimidate or threaten or coerce their victim. And this keeps victims from reaching out to others for help and causes them to become dependent on their abuser. So for an example of that, I've had clients where, they may reach out to family members or friends and inform them like, hey, I'm in this abusive situation. I'm reaching out for help. But a couple things could happen. Whoever they're reaching out to may meet that person with judgment and make them feel shame for the abuse because they may not understand the dynamics of abuse, or they may not understand why that person just doesn't leave or things like that. So then that victim is like, okay, I can't go to this person because they don't understand my situation, further isolating them. Or they go to someone, and if anyone has ever experienced this, where it's like, You know, they go to a family member or friend and the response is, well, if they ever do this again to you, you tell me, I'm going to take care of it. I'm going to handle it. And, you know, I'm going to beat them up or something like that, where there's this fear of retaliation. So that victim, who again may love and care for their abuser, they just don't want the abuse to be occurring anymore. They may not turn to that person because now they're going to fear for the safety of their abuser, even if then themselves are being abused by their abuser. So again, further isolating them. Or the abuser might say something, well, if you tell anyone, then I'm going to hurt your family members, your friends. So many factors that could be coming into play. You know, in further isolation, you know, the abuser may be controlling the person's daily activities, their interactions. So even if they are interacting with people, maybe say they're at a social event and the abuser will not let their victim, you know, leave without them. So it's like, okay, you can only speak to someone when you're in front of me. So that victim has limited ability to actually reach out for help or communicate like, hey, this is what's going on. And they might do things where they might reduce the victim's ability to gather information and know what's going on in the world and be informed. And this is going to be like, okay, where am I going with my day? What's going on in the world? That's a major factor in knowing resources and things like that. You know, they might need to get permission to go to medical appointments or to work and just complete daily tasks where it's like, okay, I need the car, I need money, I need, you know, something, and that abuser may prevent them from doing that or cause them, even if it's like, oh yeah, you go do that, but then there's something that gets in the way. You know, exhibiting jealousy. So it's like, okay, you can go hang out with your friends, but once you come home, you know, it's just not worth it because it's going to start a fight, or, you know, where were you? You're lying, you know, all these different things in terms of isolation. So even if an abuser is like, yeah, go do your thing, the consequences of going and doing your thing is not worth it for a victim. So they might then themselves isolate themselves from friends and family because they know it's just going to cause more conflict to them. So these are just many different examples of general, even without COVID, how this isolation is used. Now, when we're looking at COVID, this is amplifying that isolation, not only because, you know, the lockdowns and things like that were occurring, even though we're kind of in a different phase now, it still can be definitely used where an abuser may withhold necessary items. So that may be masks, disinfectants, hand sanitizer, all those things that we want to use to keep ourselves safe. And it's important to know for masks, like, where can you go? Where can you go and not be required to wear a mask? Nowhere, pretty much. You're like, okay, we're at a park, we're not miles away from people, but we still need to have it with us just in case if we are coming in close proximity of people. And that's important to note too, for at least for family services in the CVSS program. That's why we have the masks too available to clients, because one, not everyone is able to afford masks, and two, abuser might be utilizing, not allowing their victim to have a mask so that's preventing them from going places. So at least, you know, we have access to masks to give to clients if they come in person, to not only protect staff, but also, you know, to limit that barrier that victim might be, you know, not able to succeed in. So that's always an important thing to focus on. So, and the supporter might share misinformation about the pandemic, and this is used to either frame the victim or control them in some way, and this might prevent them from seeking proper medical attention if they have symptoms of COVID. So, for example, there was someone that I was working with where their abuser was saying, well, if you put the child in school and then, you know, they get sick or something, they're going to take the kid away and they're going to put them somewhere, who knows where, but essentially that, like, the government was going to come and take their child away from the family if they contracted COVID, which we know is, in terms of COVID, is not the case. Can't say that about everything. But in terms of other things, the abuser, again, even without COVID, they may withhold insurance. So maybe they have insurance, but they don't have the insurance card. They don't have that information, so they can't make medical appointments. Luckily for COVID, if you do need testing, for the most part, it is free, where you can go somewhere and obtain that if necessary, if the victim's able to get there and all of that jazz. And also with the isolation, the abusive partner might feel more justified, where they're using escalation of abuse tactics, because it's like, well, you can't go somewhere because you're going to go and get me infected. How dare you to go wherever because you're putting our family at risk. All these kind of things where it's like, okay, we can go out, but we just need to take the proper precautions. And it's important to be mindful of who we're interacting with to limit, but at the same time is not a reason to blow up on someone. Okay. And then another important or a huge factor in domestic violence, I'm just going to point out that, when it comes to domestic violence, financial abuse occurs in 99% of domestic violence cases. But in a study in 2014, it showed that only 78% of Americans recognize financial abuse as a form of domestic violence. So again, this kind of notion of like, okay, what does the general population think about domestic violence, is we're thinking, physical abuse. But in actuality, one of the number one forms of abuse is financial abuse. And it's huge to be mindful of. And also when we're communicating with clients and educating them about abuse, being mindful of those kind of things and barriers, so that we're educating them so that they're mindful of the dynamics of abuse that are going on. So in terms of financial abuse, this is a way to manipulate someone economically, and it may but not include, it could include, controlling family income, either not allowing the victim to access money, originally limiting their access to family funds. Maybe the abuser has, financial secrets, or it has hidden accounts that the victim doesn't know about. They might put the victim on an allowance, or allowing the victim to have no say in how money is spent. It might be that maybe the victim is working, but then they have to turn their paycheck over to their abuser. Or even on the flip side, maybe the abuser is working, but then the victim has to pay for all the bills, and the abuser doesn't put anything towards childcare or whatever. So it's putting the victim in a financial hole and limiting their resources. And also, the abuser may prevent the victim from obtaining a job, or may cause the victim to lose their job, which we'll get more into that kind of stuff later on in terms of laws when it relates to New York State. Things like that. Maybe spending will be spent on non-essentials instead of necessities. And also, the partner might steal money from them, property or identity from the partner, or force the partner to file fraudulent legal financial documents, or overspend on credit cards. Seen that a lot, where it's like, okay, the abuser's not giving money or not paying for bills, so then the victim has to put everything on their credit card, and then they're not able to catch up on that. And then it's like, okay, now we have bad credit. Or this could also go towards rent, where maybe the abuser will have the victim put all of the bills in the victim's name and not the abuser. So when those things aren't being met, then that's impacting the client's or the victim's credit, which has long-term effects for them. So this is just general financial abuse, even not considering COVID. But as we're looking at domestic violence as a whole, the impact for that is that when you're in an intimate partner violence relationship and financial abuse is a factor, which it most likely is, it has caused 8 million days of paid work of being lost, which is a lot. And the cost of IPV exceeds $8.3 billion a year. I believe that is nationally, because as we saw, it was in the trillions from globally, even before the pandemic. And between 21 to 60% of victims in IPV lose their jobs due to reasons stemming from the abuse. And that could be because the abuser either makes them quit, interferes in some way, or the victim themselves decides to leave the job due to the abuse that they're experiencing and not being able to really fulfill their needs. So maybe it is the victim's choice to leave a job, but it really was stemming from the abuse, to also be mindful of that. And then also in terms of workplace, between 2003 and 2008, 142 women were actually murdered at their workplace by their abuser, and 78% of women killed in their workplace, during that time frame. So this is important to note too, that where we're talking about financial abuse and people's jobs being impacted, sometimes to safety plan with a client, we may want a safety plan with like, okay, do we want to tell your employer about what's going on so that they can help with the situation, and that, there are things that we can try to set in place to protect you legally. Maybe we can not allow the abuser to come in. If there's a protective order, that's something that the employer should be mindful of, but also being mindful that that's up to the victim in terms of what they want to do and who they want to share that information with. So if you have someone who's like not comfortable with telling their employer, that is fine and that is their right to do that. But giving a victim option is kind of, a huge portion in empowering them and them deciding what they want to do. So being mindful of that. And then when it comes to unemployment, that impacts, and again, I want to specifically note that this particular study, which there's limited studies as it relates to domestic violence and financial abuse, unfortunately, but this particular information in terms of the effects of unemployment on IPV is related specifically to heterosexual marital relationships. And I think this study was actually done in Great Britain. Again, there's limited research done on that. So that speaks volumes to me, considering 99% of people in IPV relationships experience financial abuse. But they're showing that when a female is unemployed, that increases their risk of abuse. And expected financial dependency on the partner promotes a husband to, with a violent predisposition to either reveal his abusive nature or increase that, abusive nature. Because now it's like, okay, you're dependent on me. Where are you going to go? What are you going to do? What are your options? So that could increase the abuse. Meanwhile, for males, it kind of has the opposite effect, where maybe it's decreasing abuse because, they don't want their victim to leave them. Maybe they're going to start lying about, things associated with finances, and they're kind of trying to keep things hidden, just like how they're trying to keep things hidden from the world about their abusive tendencies. So again, that kind of has the opposite effect if the male is unemployed. But I also have some thoughts and feelings about this, because if you look at the LAP, the lethality assessment protocol, that is a program that is used when screening for high-risk clients, and one of the questions is the abuser unemployed? And that has been indicated as a potential risk factor. It's not one of the highest risk factors, but it is a risk factor. So I think it's interesting how this is opposite in terms of this study. And it's also to be mindful too, when someone's unemployed, they got a lot of time on their hands, so stalking could increase. Their thoughts are wondering where the victim is or what they're doing, and have more time to plan and plot and do whatever that they're doing in terms of gaining power and control. So keeping that mindful on that flip side. And then of course, job losses. And the threat of job loss prevent any abused women from escaping violent relationships by removing their ability to sustain themselves and their children. And that is a huge reason why a lot of people do not leave their situation. There's something in the chat. Okay, we're just getting yeses in the chat. Also, to be mindful too, if you do have questions or comments or anything, feel free to use the chat. I don't see a Q&A option, but use the chat. I'll try to park that for the end, just to be mindful of time and everyone's resources. And also, this is being recorded, so if it's something where you aren't able to stay the whole time, you can jump off and then find it on the OneDrive or the M Drive. Okay, just moving forward. Okay, and then we're looking at COVID and unemployment, which has been affecting people greatly because of everything that's going on. So globally, when we're looking at the Global Institution, this was a report from July 2020, women jobs are 1.8 times more vulnerable during COVID crisis than men's jobs. Women make up 39% of global employment, but account for 54% of overall job losses. So clearly they're being impacted more. So a reason for women losing their jobs during all of this pandemic is increased burden of unpaid care. So we're thinking childcare, which is disproportionately carried by women, or if it's childcare, or maybe we have a elderly or sick loved one that is historically placed more on women than it is on their male counterparts if we're looking at a cisgender heteronormative relationship. This, among other factors, means that women's employment is dropping faster than average, even accounting for the fact that women and men work in different sectors. And different sectors around the world are being impacted differently. So if it's something, say like IT, I would safe to say, for most IT companies, not all, I can say, are probably in a better place. Health, fit care, things like that, probably in a better place. Sanitation, things like that. But if we're looking at nationally, during the COVID recession in the United States, women's unemployment rate rose 12.8% percent points in between February and April, which is 2.9% points larger than the males, which their job losses was 9.9%. And also important to note out that even if some people are working, for women, their hours of work dropped 19% in comparison to 12% for men. So maybe people are able to work, but maybe because of childcare and all these other factors that are coming into play, they might not be working as much, or it's just not available in terms of the field that they're working in. That's just, the hours aren't there. I think even for the mall, I think they're still at reduced hours. I think it closes at 7. I haven't been to the mall, the local mall, in a very long time. So I don't know the hours, but I do believe the hours are actually reduced. So that's, a factor to look in, or restaurants are not, staying open as late as maybe they used to in the past, things like that. So part of this gender difference is explained by the nature of the shock and the disproportionate impact it has had on jobs and occupations that tend to employ more women. So in terms of where women are working, they're more likely to work in retail or personal services, and women account for 74% of employment in high contact occupations. So again, like places like hairdressers, nail salons, restaurants, things like that, those things are opening up, but we're also at a risk of those things closing down again, and all those things, a lot of uncertainty. And few women work in critical sectors that were not affected by the shutdown. And few women work in occupations with the high ability to work from home. And then as it relates to childcare, which has been such a stressor for so many families, especially when childcare wasn't an option because all the daycares and things like that were shut down. Those things are opening up more again. So many different factors, but 32% of the workforce have children under 14 at home and are affected by increased childcare needs. 21% of children in the U.S. live with a mother with no partner, and that is in comparison for 2017, compared to 5% of children living with a single father. So again, more women, single parent households that run by women versus men. And even again in 2020, when it comes to marital households, mothers provide 60% of total child care, and women provide more in the household where both partners work full time. So it's like, okay, you work your 9 to 5 or whatever it is, but you're coming home and you're still working. And then also hours are reduced for more young mothers versus young fathers. So being mindful of all that. So how is this going to affect people? Right now, we're kind of trying to live moment by moment, but these financial disparities are going to have long-term effects, unfortunately, not only for people in domestic violence situations, but for people globally, and for those that are women, has impact. So in terms of domestic violence, the domestic violence has economic impacts for the survivor throughout their lifetime. So again, kind of like I mentioned, maybe their credit has been destroyed due to the abuse that their abuser has endured, or they're not able to save money, and things like that. And it's going to take them even longer, especially those that are being impacted by COVID. Maybe their plan was to leave, but now because of COVID, they're kind of set back in terms of saving money. And this can take a very long time, especially if finances are being controlled. Maybe they can take $1 or $2 and save it away somewhere without it being noticed, just like how a victim, when they're trying to leave, we might say, take small things, a little thing here or there, that your abuser may not notice out of the home. And if you have a place to bring it when you're trying to leave, because you got to do these things slowly over time without really causing alarm. So this could be setting a lot of victims back, in terms of trying to exit their relationship. And then when it comes to COVID and the gender wage gap, I think is something that is important to point out in this training, because there are so many things in this world that are intersectional. So, more women are affected by domestic violence than men. And this is just one of those other factors where finances come into play. So according to Northwestern Mutual, women on average reach their peak earnings at the age of 44. Meanwhile, men continue to grow and increase their earnings, and that usually averages out by age 55. So really setting them up for success when it comes to retirement time, getting closer there. And then for white women, they earn anywhere between 79 to 82 cents per dollar in comparison to men. And that earnings of the dollar to the man is even lower for women of color, and that can be as low as 52 cents to the dollar that a man makes. So again, disproportionately putting women at a disadvantage in terms of finances. And both groups carry, for women of color or white women carry more debt than their male counterparts and are less likely to save or invest. Fun facts in terms of finances, it wasn't until 1973 that women were allowed to actually open up their own personal checking account without either their father or their husband or someone like that actually signing off on it, which is a huge stride, but we're still within that generational impact of that. So we're kind of like, okay, now we have access to that, but not everyone's going to get access or want access to that because of however they're living their lives. And also because of gender stereotypes and gender norms. How many times, at least this was a message I received growing up, was like, okay, find a good man who makes money so he can take care of you, versus like, go out forth in the world, Melissa, and provide for yourself. Actually, that was something my mother provided a lot of information from, but other external matriarchies in the family were kind of like, find a good man. So they can take care of you. And that's still a message that many women might be receiving, versus like, hey, go out, be financially independent, save your money, invest your money, things like that. Which definitely look into investing. There's good time, but do it properly, responsibly, all those kind of things. Anyways, so on top of, since women are losing their jobs at a higher rate than men, during this gap could be continuing to grow. And from earlier recessions, to note that for those who lost their jobs in, other recessions, it took them equivalent of 3 years to get back to, or they've lost 3 years of earnings overall in their career. And that was happening over a short period of time, but that's a significant impact where, maybe you're in a year of a recession or a job loss, but really in actuality, you're losing like 3 years of income and resources, which is just craziness. And then of course, you know, it's harder to find jobs. People are like looking for jobs. Jobs are in demand for many folks, but that means that the employers may, depending on what sector they're in, kind of hold people differently. So, and if they are trying to get a job, you know, the pay might not be as comparable to what they were once, you know, having. So all these other factors. Okay. And then another huge factor when it comes to COVID is substance use. Now, this can relate to those within domestic violence relationships, but also just overall. That was another issue for a lot of people who are in substance abuse, where they had a lack of resources in terms of, you know, who they can reach out to, social isolation for those who have substance use issues, or yeah, is not good. And kind of for those within substance abuse or substance use issues, you know, having a steady routine, stability, all of those things are going to aid folks in maintaining sobriety and not using maladaptive coping. So again, you know, when it comes to social isolation, psychological and economic stress, this puts people at an increased risk of engaging in maladaptive coping, which could include excessive alcohol consumption. And this in turn could potentially increase a risk of experiencing violence within a home. And also, as like restaurants, bars, pubs, if you're thinking globally, are closed, people began drinking more within the confines of their home. And then still, even in New York, where it's like, okay, you could go get food and then have, you know, to go alcohol too. That's another factor. But even now, people may not want to go out because they're like, oh, well, I have to buy food in order to have a drink, so I'm just not going to do that. And I also have like the little funny quote unquote meme where a lot of people were putting, where it's like, oh, you know, either we're going to come out of this lockdown with amazing cooking skills, or we're going to have a drinking problem. But as we go to the next slide, these memes actually are more problematic during the quarantine than they actually, you know, than they're actually funny. But we don't have time to really go into all of that. But as we're looking at substance use during COVID, this was a study that just came out in September. It was a self-reporting study, so that, you know, taking that into factors. But the study showed that Americans are drinking 14% more often in this pandemic than prior to the pandemic. And women have increased their frequency of drinking by 17% compared to last year. And when it comes to heavy drinking, which includes 4 drinks or more in a few hours, that has spiked by 41% for women during this pandemic, which is a lot. And as bars and restaurants closed, retail alcohol sales went up. Stores sold 54% more alcohol in late March compared to the year prior. And online sales have increased by 262% from 2019, which is, that whole situation is astonishing, not only because of the statistic, but I did not know you could buy alcohol online. So that was very interesting personally for me. Now you all know, if you didn't know already. But again, noting that more alcohol consumption is occurring at home versus out in maybe a social situation. So how does this intersect with domestic violence? So research finds that domestic violence and substance abuse are correlated, that substance abuse is a risk factor for more severe domestic violence. But it's also important to note that, you know, there might be intersections, but substance abuse does not equal domestic violence. So substance abuse does not cause domestic violence. It could increase the risk of severity if someone is a substance abuse user or a substance abuser and domestic violence abuser. So most abusers do not have substance use problems, and those who do may continue to abuse their partners even after they stop using drugs and alcohol. So again, you know, hearing, if you're safety planning with clients or interacting with a client, you know, hearing, okay, well, the abuse only happens when they're drugging or drinking. You know, for me, I'm like, okay, but I like to dive deeper and try to look into what the relationship is like, try to look for the other red flags of other power and control. So maybe when they're drugging and drinking, maybe that increases the risk of physical violence occurring. But when substance use and drinking and drugging isn't happening, maybe there's still jealousy and isolation and controlling, the verbal abuse and all of those other factors. So trying to be mindful and again, educating our clients and so that they are mindful of red flags and the dynamics that are occurring within their relationship. So being important, knowing all that. And also it's important to note the victims of IPV may struggle with substance use issues that predate the abuse or worsened by the abuse or rose as a result of the abuse as a way of coping with the trauma reactions. So that I'm also wondering, as for the previous slide, you know, why is it that women are drinking so heavily now? I know that there's a lot of memes or videos out there where, you know, it's like so funny and cute where it's like, you know, the mom has a glass of wine or a bottle of wine and the kids like driving around the neighborhood in their little like automatic Jeep electronic car thing and driving the parent around while they're drinking, or, you know, all these shirts that are coming out where it's saying, oh, this group or this generation of kids in school aren't going to be doing so well because parents are at home drinking while taking care of their kids. You know, it's all kind of like funny that when we're kind of showcasing this and making it seem like everyone is drinking, you know, for those who might abuse alcohol might be like, oh, well, everyone's doing it, so it's normal that I'm doing this. All parents are drinking while they're at home. You know, I got to do this to take care of my kids. I got to use this as a coping, when it's reactionality. That's not necessarily good. We got to, you know, be on it, especially when we got young ones. You know, of course, everyone can drink responsibly, but, you know, all these different factors to take in mind. And then this is just a good slide of comparison in terms of, you know, the differences between someone who's a substance abuse user versus someone who is a domestic violence abuser, and how they are different. But in lieu of time, I'm going to just leave this here. And I can send out, if you're interested in having access to the PowerPoint, feel free to email me. My email will be at the end and I can feel free to send it to you. Okay. And when we're looking at the pandemic, when we're looking at domestic violence, even though in interpersonal violence, we're kind of talking about like two people, but again, this can very much extend to those with children within the household. So according to the CDC in 2019, at least 1 in 7 children have experienced childhood abuse or neglect. In 2018, a little over 1,700 children died of abuse and neglect in the US, and that was in 2018. And rates of child abuse and neglect are 5 times higher for children and families with low SES compared to children in families who have high social economic status. And 30 to 60% of intimate partner violence perpetrators also abuse children in the household. Also to be mindful, if there's domestic violence in the household, that puts if there's children in the household, that puts them at an increased risk of also being abused sexually. So just being mindful of that. And again, abuse, neglect, all can look different. So maybe, you know, their primary victim might be getting physically abused, emotionally abused, all that jazz. And the kids might just be, well, not just, might be getting verbally abused, emotionally abused, those kind of things. But it's like, oh, but I don't hit my kids. But all this other abuse and neglect is going on at the same time. And of course, abuse for children have long health and well-being impacts if let untreated. So this could increase their risk of having injury, further violence or victimizations or perpetration, substance use, sexual abuse, lower educational attainment, limited employment opportunities. So again, looking at financial abuse, where it's like, okay, we don't have this foundation, this is putting it at a high risk factor of economic and economic disparities. Okay. Now, children vulnerable during COVID to abuse. So again, we're focusing on economics. When there's economic stressors, that puts more stress on the family, and then that increases increases the risk factors of a child being abused or neglected. Let's see, yeah, and even in the Great Recession, that was a great example of a link of increased risk of child abuse. Just move through this. Yeah. So, and then of course we're all home again together. You know, if we're stressed out, if a parent's stressed out, they're more likely to address their own child's anxious behaviors or demands in an aggressive or abusive way. So again, when working with folks, especially those with children, I mean, it's always important for self-care and all of those type of things. But if we're not able to fill our own cup, how can we fill those and take care of others? So really being mindful of, you know, taking care of ourselves when we have children or just in general, so that we can address other people's needs, especially if it's a toddler or kids. There's always going to be stressors. There's always being like, how are you eating again? You know, stop fighting with your sibling, you know, all those different things. And especially when, for at least in the beginning of COVID, or maybe still, there's a lot of stressors and anxiety and uncertainty, and children are going to absorb that. So they're looking to their parents for answers, for comfort. But if they're stressed out and they're responding and anxious and showing this to their child, then that's going to impact their child as well and their mental health as well. So other factors with that. And the most immediate effect of the pandemic is the decline in reported cases of child maltreatment. So for many states across the country, they were seeing anywhere between 20 to 70% of a drop in the month of March. Again, if we're looking at rates of calls in terms of domestic violence hotline calls, similar to Child Protective Services, when is there ever a lull in that? It's like never ending for those poor people. So, you know, when there's a drop in that, that's concerning because things aren't being reported and things aren't being investigated, and that's putting people and children more at risk of, you know, being in unhealthy and unsafe situations. So due to the pandemic, children are kept away or limited from, you know, contact with their schools, their doctors, and community activities. Again, things are slowly, you know, starting to open up. Kids might be doing the hybrid, or they might be going in some states full time. It's, you know, every state and school district is different in terms of their approach. Or people are just choosing to not have their children go when it is an option, you know, and that's always a family choice. Again, doctors and community activities are slowly starting to open, but not to the same extent as they were previously. So it's okay, we're having less interactions in terms of in-person interactions. So in most states, professionals that come in frequent contact with children and youth are mandated reporters. So teachers, you know, pediatricians, lawyers, police, other, you know, daycare providers and things like that. So again, we're not seeing those people as often as maybe we used to. And according to the Administration for Children and Family, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, in 2018, 67.3% of CPS reports came from mandated professionals. And to break that down further, 20.5% of that 63%, or 67% came from teachers. And I think it's important to note that even if children are seeing their teachers virtually, it's not the same interaction. Where maybe they're not gaining the same type of relationship as they would with that child when they're in person versus virtually. Oh God, I don't know if you've seen those videos of the poor teachers again, where it's like, please silence, hit your mute button, like the entire time, and trying to like focus on like managing that. Is, you know, it's difficult versus maybe when you see a child in person, you know, you're like, oh, little Billy or little Sally, you know, seems a little off today, or maybe they're seeing bruises on that child, or the child is coming to school and, you know, they're disheveled or not smelling good, or maybe they're noticing they're not coming to school, or their account at school isn't being filled for food. You know, these are all the indicators that they might see versus now when they see their kid and they're still in their pajamas from yesterday, but that might be just a common occurrence in the world. Am I right? But so also, and it's important to note that again, even though the general population, friends, family, neighbors can make reports, it's less likely. So in 2019, again, they were only seeing a 16.6% of reports coming from those non-professionals. And this could easily be because, professionals who are mandated reporters, we're getting the trainings. We know what to do. We know what to expect when we're doing those things versus someone in the general population, they might be like, oh, well, that's a family matter. I'm not going to get into it. That's their choice. I don't want to get into their business or whatever it might be, even though you can make the report anonymously, which may, the general population may not know. So all those kind of factors. So other ways that COVID is impacting safety and safety planning. So programs that serve survivors may be significantly impacted and shelters may be full or may even stop intakes altogether. Or survivors may fear entering shelters because of being in close quarters with other groups of people. That was a huge issue too, even with the homeless shelters where they were trying to figure out what are we going to do with these pods? How are we going to keep people safe? Even the occupants of those spaces, but also the staff and whatever else. Obviously I can't speak for the shelters in New York, but, I still work per diem for another agency in Connecticut where, the sheltering, well, to be honest, it was a rare occurrence when the shelter wasn't full, but even if it was, there was space for a day, it was, usually filled by the end of the day. But the procedures in terms of sheltering were definitely altered in the beginning of COVID. And that was, a factor to look into. Even, we may have had folks coming to safe spaces where we would meet, people either at the hospital, police station, or in the office, and then transport them to a shelter or a safe place. But in terms of even still, that's a factor too, where luckily that agency has a relationship with a taxi service, so they will take them where they need to go. But, all these little things that you may not think about, where we got to think about safety and transportation, all this other stuff. And for a long period of time, public transportation was not an option for a lot of folks. But now, luckily, that's opening up. So we're kind of having more options, but a lot of tricky, different, problem-solving skills, were really coming into play, especially during COVID. And even for family services in our program, I was thinking, oh, maybe we're going to have a little lull time. That did not happen, and even though maybe in the beginning we weren't all in the office and we're starting to, we're back in the office more often now, but we were still, getting hotline calls and responding that way, even though, again, even going to the hospital wasn't an option. Now it is, all these other factors, court, literally so many things were shutting down and look so different now in comparison to last year. Travel restrictions, I think we briefly went over all the other things on this for the most part. Okay. Now, when it comes to New York State's response to IPV during COVID, so Governor Cuomo has signed executive orders that will help victims of domestic violence to obtain OVS services, so specifically victim compensation. Normally in the state of New York, without this executive order, one would need like police reports to be able to access the Office of Victim Services Victim Compensation Program. But right now, the way that it is going is that you do not need that in order to apply for victim compensation. But to note that this only applies to residential programs. And those residential programs specific to Dutchess County are Grace Smith House and the House of Hope, which that information is right on the slide if you need it. But a good quick Google search can also get you that information. So that means that this does not apply to family services in the CVSS program because we're not technically a residential program. My hope is that this executive order will expand and continue and just become a regular order and not a limited order. This is specifically extended to November 5th of 2020. It keeps getting, every couple months, he keeps signing and extending it. But my hope is that this will actually come into full force and just be part of the program in general. And my hope is that this will actually expand to other non-residential programs. So, agencies like ourselves can do that without folks needing to make reports to the police, because when we're looking at domestic violence, there are so many reasons why folks do not call the police to report abuse. May that be because their abuser broke their phone again and they're unable to call, or they feel that, if I call, it will make it worse, or maybe they have called in the past and nothing that in terms of what they wanted to be seen done wasn't completed. There's so many factors that come into play when it comes to a victim's decision to or not to call the police. And also, fun facts, if you are unable to call the police, but you still have access to a cell phone, you can actually text 911 now. Yeah, I know, I'm seeing reactions. I know, it's great. So I know that's specific to Dutchess County. I know in Connecticut that's a thing as well. We're across the Connecticut state where you can text, and now I don't know if for New York State if it's across the whole state, but I think it's similar to if you were to call the national hotline, depending on your area code, it would probably link you to the local membership or agency that is, related to your area code. I don't know how it works with texting, but at least, that can come through. And I know folks who are police and law enforcement and just they're like, yeah, we just get it up on our screen. Like we would get a normal call and be like, came through text. And that is good and mindful for them, because then it's like, okay, what's going on that they weren't able to call versus text. So, for them to be safe as well when they're going to domestic violence calls, which are very dangerous calls to go to because you never know what to expect. So yeah, I'm really hoping that New York is on the forefront of services for victim compensation, but I do believe we have a lot where to go. But we are much better than other states, because I've worked with other states, not so great. And also when it comes to OVS and victim compensation, if you don't know this already, where the crime was committed, that is where you would apply for the OVS. So say if you were in Connecticut and a crime was committed against you, that's the organization, Connecticut OVS would be where you would file with, versus if a crime was committed in New York, you go to the New York OVS. So fun facts on that. So also when it comes to New York's response, this was even something that was done pre-COVID, that there are laws that in the state of New York where it prevents someone from losing their job due to domestic violence. And the employer needs to make reasonable accommodations to help that victim and that employee to maintain their job and all those kind of things. And for example, like giving the employee a day off to attend court and not reprimanding them for needing to take that day off. And also, we actually have a great program. It's unemployment insurance benefits as it relates to domestic violence. So if you've lost your job because of domestic violence, may that be because you were fired, which you legally are not allowed to be. But if for some reason you had to leave a job because of domestic violence and you can prove that, then you can potentially get unemployment insurance benefits. And of course, you can just Google New York State Department of Labor, but the number is there for more information on that program, which is just so lovely. And then again, in terms of timing and stuff, I think I'm like speeding through this, but we're getting there. So how to support someone in an IPV relationship. And this is more for folks who maybe are still in the learning phases on how to support people, or just supporting friends or family or whoever that you might experience. So first and foremost, listening to them, believing them, trying to understand without judgment where they're coming from, because again, every situation is different. The reason people stay is always different. And someone pressuring someone to get support or to leave is not going to necessarily help the situation. Again, it might further isolate that person from reaching out to you or reaching out to services, that kind of thing. So, you know, but also being able to express like, hey, I'm worried about your safety. That's something that I talk with clients all the time, where they're kind of sharing something, maybe they're minimizing something. And, you know, I'll point out, you know, this is sounding like, you know, I'm a little worried about this situation because of X, Y, and Z, and kind of exploring that with them and safety planning with them, and you know, seeing what we can do. But again, leaving it in the ball is in their court in terms of what they're going to choose to do. We can offer information, but you know, it's like a la carte, where they're picking what they want to do and what they don't want to do, and that's empowering for them. Again, offering support, letting them know they're not alone and no one deserves to be hurt, no one deserves to be abused. That's another thing where, you know, even though I'm doing individual counseling with victims, I'm also the group facilitator of the domestic violence support group, and that is a huge thing for them. They like, you know, they know they're not alone, but once they're actually in group, if they're qualified to be in group, just having that additional support and being like, wow, like you're experiencing something similar to me, or even if our experiences or our background is completely different, we have so many commonalities, and that brings solace for them. Providing resources like family services, or other resources that might be available, in terms of shelters, mental health services, anything that they may need. Again, Family Services is such an amazing agency, and there's just so much to offer, and so much in the family partnership building, and just so many connections that we can make for clients in our own community that many people may not know about. Help to make a safety plan. Again, if it's something, well, it is not within your wheelhouse to do so, feel free, send them over to an advocate, a crisis worker, something like that. Or just trying to do our best to help and support people in terms of safety. And again, I haven't reinforced this, respecting someone's choices, and letting them know that I'm still going to be here to support you. And then in terms of specific to COVID, very similar, but cultivating hope and focusing on things they can control. And I think this is something that not even just for people in IPV relationships, but also just the general population, you know, focusing on things we can control, encouraging self-care and and adaptive coping, trying to exercise, video call with loved ones, or spending increased time in the shower specific to someone who's in abusive relationships. They can be away from their abuser for just like a little longer, and self-care time. If someone likes showering, that's lovely. And building a community around survivors. So, you know, checking in, safety planning, you know, for myself, you know, I might see people in person, I might be able to call them, or we might do video sessions and we safety plan around which is the best options. Am I able to call you? Are we able to leave you a voicemail? Can you get emails? All of these different things. So, you know, trying to build that community if it's safe to do so. And then these are just, you know, very few resources in terms of, you know, different resources in Dutchess County or the Hudson Valley. Again, Family Services, the CBSS program, the helpline for substance or mental health concerns, and, you know, the United Way 211 helpline is a beautiful resource. You can go to the 211 United Way website and just put in a zip code of where you need resources and look into specific things like, okay, maybe I need food resources, I need housing resources, I need baby formula, I need daycare resources. Anything like that should be on that website in terms of connecting to resources, and I just love it. So you can either call or text. That's always, again, a fun thing. Text your zip code, the number is there, but again, you can just go to their website if necessary. And kind of sped through all of that, and I'm just going to see if anyone does have questions. Feel free to put them in the chat. But this is my contact information. So maybe if there's something where you're like myself and you're like 2 hours from now, you're like, oh, I have a question about that. Or, oh yeah, that is something I wanted to talk about. You can feel free to send me an email for follow-up. Yeah, and we'll just wait a few moments for anyone who might have questions in the chat. If not, I surely appreciate everyone that attended this training. I appreciate everyone being here with our technical delays of getting things started. I just appreciate everyone's time. Just gonna, I never know if people actually can see the chat when I have it on my shared. Yes, and everyone, yes, you are welcome. So yeah, I think that's it for today. And again, thank you all. If you want a copy of the training, feel free to send me an email, and I'm more than happy to send my PowerPoint to everyone. So yes, thank you again. All right.
Melissa, I'm going to stop recording.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.